Good day, everybody. This is Chris with the Ancient Scholar, and I hope this video finds you all doing well. And I hope that you've had a great winter thus far. I know in some areas of the country it's been pretty rough, and I hope that everybody is coming through okay. So what I'd like to talk about is something that's been all over the news and has been discussed quite a bit, so I don't know that I have anything novel to add to the discussion, pun intended. And that, of course, is of the COVID-19. And what is COVID-19? Well, COVID-19 is the name of a disease that is kind of catching the attention of the world, really. And COVID-19 stands for the coronavirus disease discovered in 2019. So I thought what I'd do is I'd start off by just talking a little bit about the disease before we could talk about statistics and what to do and what may happen and try to infer and hypothesize and pretend to be a pundit about some idea or another. I really just want to sit down and just talk about, well, what is this, what's going on, and just develop some understanding and some intuition surrounding this particular problem. So first and foremost, this is not a new phenomena by any means. And so I'll start there and I'll just talk about this specifically, and then we'll just talk about coronaviruses maybe a little more broadly, because coronaviruses are a very common problem. And it is only when you get certain types of coronaviruses or certain types of physiology of people that may interact in unique ways with coronaviral infections, where you get these more novel presentations. But by and large, coronavirus infections can range from just asymptomatic, no signs or symptoms, to common cold. So let's go ahead and just talk about this. All right, so COVID-19, the coronavirus disease 2019, is caused by the 2019 novel just means unique or newly emerging coronavirus. And this is sometimes, sometimes referred to as the 2019 little n, big C, little o, big V. And that just stands for 2019 novel coronavirus, right? So all this terminology looks super sophisticated, but it really isn't. The vernacular term for this is that prior to a couple of weeks ago, the vernacular term was sometimes referred to as the Wuhan coronavirus. And the official name for this virus is known as the SARS CoV-2. And SARS is a term that should be familiar with some of us, and that stands for sudden or severe. I believe severe is the proper term. Severe acute respiratory syndrome. Right? So when we talk about different SARS epidemics of the past, those epidemics were in fact caused by a coronavirus. So coronaviruses have been around for a long time. All right. So the official name is the SARS, the Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome Coronavirus 2. All right. And this is remarkably similar to the SARS outbreak that occurred in 2002. It was actually the CoV-2 coronavirus variant that was responsible for the SARS outbreak in 2002. Okay, so coronaviruses are fairly ubiquitous. They're all over. They infect many different species of animals. But let's just focus our discussion around the human coronavirus. or human coronaviruses would be a better way of putting that. So, human coronaviruses. We'll talk a little bit about them. Okay, so first and foremost, oftentimes they're benign. They're often quite benign. And in many cases, patients will be asymptomatic, as I mentioned earlier. And they may never develop signs and symptoms of infection. And the coronaviruses are a very common cause of the so-called common cold. So most of us, the majority of humanity, has at one point in time, multiple points in time, had to deal with a coronavirus infection without any substantial long-term sequelae for the most part. And I believe approximately 25% of all cases of the so-called common cold, at least a quarter of them are due to coronaviral infections. So this is pretty common stuff. However, certain types of coronaviruses can be much more problematic, and so let's just talk about some of the past or some of the prior events or prior problems involving the coronaviruses. So as I mentioned earlier, in 2002, there was an epidemic that spread to several parts of the world, and this was referred to as the SARS epidemic of 2002. And the SARS epidemic in 2002, the viral reservoir was thought to be in bats, and then mutations occurred and allowed that a species crossover, and it looked like from bats it crossed over into little cat-like animals called civets. And then from there was a crossover to humans. And in certain areas of the world, this is more problematic because you have a kind of you have illegal animal trading. So you have black market dealing with rare animals and animals thought to have medicinal benefits. And so you get this whole illegal animal trade where animals get abducted from the wild, and so you get a situation where animals that might not necessarily come into contact with humans are now coming into contact with humans. And so that is one area of concern. And then the other area of concern is something known as bushmeat. And in certain areas of the world, human beings, simply in an attempt to feed themselves, go out and come into contact with these animals and hunt these animals, and then you have exposure to those animals in that way. So through bushmeat and illegal animal trading, many of these, not only coronaviruses, but many of these other viral illnesses, such as the viral hemorrhagic fevers, can kind of get a hold into humanity, and that kind of begins this nasty progression into epidemics and potentially even pandemics. So that was the 2002 SARS. More recently, there was the 2012 so-called MERS, and MERS stands for Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome. And this is simply it's characteristically similar to what we saw in 2002, the signs and symptoms of the respiratory distress. Pretty much, in many cases, pretty much match what we saw in 2002, but in 2012, it actually originated from the Middle East, and again, bats served as the reservoir. And there's an interesting reason why bats are really interesting in that they can mount a substantial immune response. So when bats get infected with viruses in particular, their bodies can mount a pretty substantial immune response, and kind of keep that viral infection at bay, so the bats don't necessarily develop signs and symptoms of the virus, but they can still carry the virus and then shed that virus, and the virus to varying degrees can replicate within their body, but not enough to maybe actively kill the bats or cause substantial disease. And so you get this replication, and then the bats can shed the virus. And as the virus is replicating, anytime you are copying genetic material, there's a chance for mutations to occur, or one virus can kind of fuse with another virus, and then you get a new genome as a result of that, and a new virus that may be able to have proteins that allow it to attach to other tissues of other animals, and then you get this crossover. So that's kind of why we see a lot of these, the reservoirs in bats due to their immune response, whereas human beings, we don't have that kind of response, and so some diseases, the reservoir, it's not, humans don't make as great of a reservoir. We're great to be the terminal organism of the infection, but not necessarily a reservoir that can kind of sustain high viral loads and kind of spread the virus around. So that's kind of why we see that in bats. But anyway, there was a crossover from bats to camels, and then another crossover from there to humans. And that was responsible for the 2012 MERS. Again, these are all coronaviral infections. And then more recently, and in more contemporary times, of course, in 2019, we saw our first cases of a new epidemic of a coronaviral infection emerge from the Wuhan area of China. And that's why initially this was referred to as the Wuhan coronavirus. That's since been changed to something a little more descriptive, but that's kind of a vernacular term that's still out there. But it emerged, we think it emerged from the Wuhan area of China in a meat market, is likely where the index cases came from, and from there has spread to dozens of countries outside of China. However, most of the cases are still within China and China proper. And again, this is the 2019 nCoV, and it emerged again from China, likely in bats again, and then it looks like we've isolated viral genomes that are remarkably similar to the current genome of the COVID-19 that we see in an animal known as a pangolin. Pangolin is kind of like a small armadillo anteater looking, well, not necessarily small, but a smaller armadillo anteater looking animal. And this connection with illegal animal trade is very strong with pangolins, because in China, Southeast Asia, the pangolins kind of have a scaly outer structure, and those scales are thought to have substantial medicinal benefits in certain cultures. And so there's a big black market trade surrounding the pangolins. And so we think that probably played a role, as it has in other epidemics, but then from pangolins there was a crossover to human beings. I know there have been some reports of other animals like snakes and things like that, but I think currently it looks like all the evidence is pointing to a bat to pangolin crossover and a pangolin to human crossover. That's the most probable thing at this point. Okay, so as of 24 February, so I'm a few days behind, but as of 24 February 2020, what are we currently looking at? We're currently looking at approximately, and I'm just going to go approximately here, approximately 80,000 total cases. It was actually, I think, 79,000 some change, but I'm just adding a little in there and rounding up because it's a couple days after that. But we're looking at approximately 80,000 cases. with approximately 72,000 of those cases being in China. And these, of course, are documented cases, and then approximately 2,000 cases outside of China. So it's still very much a China problem, but we're now seeing cases of spread to Europe and other areas of the world. We're looking at Italy, France, Germany. We do have some cases in the United States, and there's some speculation as to maybe a case or two that has spread from somebody who has not had travel outside of the United States. I think that's kind of still up in the air at this point, but be that as it may, it's still primarily in China, and it obviously has spread. Basically, it's spread to every continent in the world, with the exception of Antarctica at this point in time. Now, the problem here is you have to ask yourself, how reliable do you think the information is coming out of China and other countries? I don't know. It's a question you have to ask. So how reliable is the reporting? And the other question we need to ask is, when we look at prior human coronavirus behavior, we know that it's often benign, it's often asymptomatic, and it can often present with signs and symptoms of the common cold. And so it may be very difficult to have a true appreciation of the actual number of people that are being infected with the COVID-19, or rather being infected with the 2019 novel coronavirus, because it's very likely that many, many more people are infected with the 2019 novel coronavirus, but are not necessarily manifesting with the COVID-19. Because remember, COVID-19 is the disease that manifests as a result of the 2019 novel coronavirus. So it's possible there could be perhaps hundreds of thousands or millions of people that have already been infected, but are just asymptomatic. We don't really have a good idea of what's going on there quite yet. When we look at the death rates, again, this is kind of hard to parse out at this point, but let's just give ourselves at least some appreciation of what's going on. So the death or mortality rate. All right, and again, I'm using statistics from the World Health Organization from 24 February 2020. So there are approximately, in China, there have approximately been 2,600 to 3,000 reported deaths, somewhere in that neighborhood, and approximately 25 to 30 outside of China. In China, on average, we're looking at somewhere in the neighborhoods of 3, maybe up to 4% mortality, depending on how you look at the data, how you classify the data. Outside, you're looking at approximately 1% mortality. You could zoom in and go, well, look at this specific area, and maybe it's higher, like 8 or 10%, and then you zoom into another area, and it's maybe even less than 1%. But somewhere in this neighborhood, somewhere into 1 to 3, 1 to 4% overall mortality. So the overall mortality rates are not particularly high, but the concern is, what if this becomes a pandemic, and you take a country like the United States that has 300 million change, and then you say, well, let's be charitable and say it's a 1% mortality rate, and then you could expect, well, what's 1% of 300? That's 1, so you're looking at a million and change deaths. And that's obviously that's conjecture, right? And unfortunately, I could be very hyperbolic in the way I approach this, and throw that out there without all these caveats. and that can really get people riled up. And there is a little bit of that occurring, and I'm looking at the news, and there's a lot of political banter as well, particularly here in the United States, where we're in an election year, and we have different news organizations that have essentially different allegiances. Some organizations are a little more progressive, or what they define as progressive leaning, and so they'll give a certain party the benefit of the doubt, and then other organizations are more, I suppose, what they refer to as a conservative leaning, and will give that party the benefit of the doubt. And so this is all being used in interesting ways, to say the least, and I'm going to stay away from that, and I really do just want to focus on what do we know, what can we make of this so far. Okay, so that's just the basic data. So now what I want to do is I just want to spend a few minutes actually talking about what a coronavirus is and kind of how they work. All right, so here is a diagram that I made of a coronavirus, just to kind of show you the different parts of it. And so when we talk about coronavirus, corona is a term that often means crown, right? You can think of wearing a crown. And so when we look at electron micrographs and X-ray crystallography of a coronavirus, we have something. This is actually this is a little cross section here. You have something that looks like this. So you have this virus, this envelope in black here, that surrounds the genetic material inside of the virus, and then there are two major things that come out, or rather embedded within the envelope. You have these what I drew in red, these what are called spike glycoproteins, and then in blue you have these hemagglutinin esterase dimers. And these hemagglutinin and spike glycoproteins actually enable the virus to dock, in for lack of better words, attach to other cells. And so these proteins, the hemagglutinin esterase dimers and the spike glycoproteins, are both proteins, have a special shape called a conformation, and that allows them to bind to very specific cells. And the cells that most coronaviruses bind to via these proteins embedded in their envelope tend to be respiratory cells. So cells within the human and animal respiratory tract are the targets. And so these spike glycoproteins bind, these hemagglutinin esterase dimers bind, and these are similar to the hemagglutinin esterase dimers that we see in influenza, right? And I've had prior videos where I've talked about neuraminidase and hemagglutinin proteins in the influenza virus, specifically the influenza A virus. So it's a similar mechanism, and even similar tissue types impacted. And in fact, the signs and symptoms of the COVID-19 are initially very similar to influenza, as far as fever, chills, cough, chest pain. However, in some cases, people can develop severe gastrointestinal signs and symptoms, such as abdominal pain, nausea, vomiting, severe diarrhea, and so on. And then in some cases, these patients can go on to develop a respiratory failure and require a mechanical ventilation, intubation. And in some cases, you can get a very strong inflammatory response. And things like cytokine storm can develop in human beings. And we see this in other severe viral illnesses as well. And the exaggerated inflammatory response can actually cause damage. This can cause further damage to the body, the lungs and other organ systems, and make the body susceptible to secondary infections. So these people may develop additional, like pneumonias, not only a pneumonia from the virus, but maybe a bacterial, an opportunistic infection comes in. That can happen as well. And then they can have multi-organ dysfunction, things like ARDS and liver failure and renal failure and so on and so forth. And it's really not necessarily the viral infection, but the human body's over-exaggerated inflammatory response in an attempt to deal with this viral infection that can cause the damage in some of these cases. And there is speculation that certain genetic makeup may be associated with poorer or better outcomes, as well as just general health of the infected individual, how old or how young they may be, and any underlying medical problems that they may have. Okay, so once this virus docks to the human respiratory cell, it has this genetic material inside of it, this what we call positive sense single-stranded RNA. RNA stands for ribonucleic acid. And essentially, it injects that RNA into the cell. So to understand what's going on there, I just want to review something very quickly. And this is something sometimes referred to as the central dogma of molecular biology. The central dogma of molecular biology. And the central dogma of molecular biology, and we say that somewhat sarcastically because there really aren't, or there shouldn't be dogmas in science and the scientific method, so it's a central rule of thumb, but dogma just sounds better. But essentially what you have in eukaryotic cells, plant and animal cells, is the cells have a nucleus here, and that nucleus contains the genetic material typically in the form of something called DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid. And that DNA is coiled up, and it's a double-stranded structure. And it has it's essentially a code-like structure, and then the DNA is further coiled up into structures called chromosomes. And then what that DNA does is it codes for proteins. And so anytime a cell needs to do something, it needs to make a protein, and that protein goes and does something, the DNA is the set of instructions. It is essentially a blueprint for creating all the proteins that a cell needs to create. Now, what happens in eukaryotic cells is the DNA stays inside of the nucleus, and so it can be protected, and other proteins are also inside of the nucleus, and these other proteins can unravel and unwind and help copy that DNA, and you've got proteins like you have several. I don't think we need to go into all the different proteins involved in that, but you also have several different kinds of proteins that are involved in wrapping the DNA, unwrapping, unzipping it, capping it off, copying it, repairing it, and so on and so forth. But essentially what happens in a process known as transcription, the DNA gets copied into a single strand of another genetic material called mRNA or messenger RNA. And the messenger RNA is single-stranded, but it contains the code for that protein. So essentially, it's a kind of carbon copy of the DNA. So you take the blueprint, and you don't want to damage the blueprint, so you copy it, and then the copy can leave the nucleus, and then that messenger RNA will typically work its way outside of the nucleus, aided by proteins, of course, and then it will make its way along a structure within the cytoplasm of the cell, referred to as in the rough endoplasmic reticulum. That's one major area. And this rough endoplasmic reticulum is like a little highway, and it has like its rough appearance because it has these little structures embedded in it called ribosomes. And these ribosomes, the messenger RNA comes into contact with those ribosomes, and those ribosomes, in essence, read the instructions from the messenger RNA. And so the messenger RNA is then transcribed, or translated, transcription is from DNA to RNA, but then what happens is the ribosomes read the messenger RNA, and the messenger RNA tells the ribosomes how to make whatever protein needs to be made in something called translation. And that's how our cells make all the proteins that they need to make. Now, in the setting of this viral infection, what happens is the coronavirus injects its RNA. So what happens is that RNA gets injected directly into the cell, and then the RNA will make its way to the ribosomes. And there are some other proteins as well that help assist with this, but essentially that injected RNA makes its way into the cell, comes into contact with these ribosomes, and then instead of those ribosomes creating proteins that the cells need, they turn into virus factories. And that RNA that was injected by the coronavirus is actually a set of instructions designed to tell the cell to make viruses instead of proteins. And so what happens is the virus-infected cells begin making viruses, and eventually the cell dies because it can't make proteins and all of its resources are going to viral production. The cell dies, it then ruptures, and it releases viruses out into the body, and then those viruses can go on to infect other cells, reprogram those cells, they create viruses, they die, and so on and so forth. So that is what, in general, this is a very high-level, high-yield, basic understanding of what's going on when it comes to viral infections. Specifically, when we talk about single-stranded RNA viruses, there are other kinds of viruses that have some slightly different ways of working, but that's what we see here. Okay, so I've been rambling on for over half an hour, and hopefully you understand the virus a little better and what's going on, and maybe I'll make some subsequent videos talking about some of the potential treatment options that are out there, and some of the potential emerging treatment options that are out there. But at the end of the day, I just wanted to make this video to hopefully give people some basic understanding of what's going on, because the more that we actually understand what's actually going on, that should help inform us in a more critical way, and we're able to make better decisions without all the hyperbole. All right, guys, I hope you all are doing well, and we'll see you in the next video. Take care.